It's strange how the world feels completely different after midnight, as if the moment the clock quietly passes a certain hour, everything around you begins to shift in a way that's subtle but impossible to ignore. Like nothing has physically changed, and yet something feels off, heavier, quieter, almost as if the world itself has become aware of your presence. And for people who work night shifts, that feeling isn't just imagination. It becomes something they experience so often that it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a pattern they can't escape. The silence at that hour doesn't feel natural. It feels dense, almost physical, pressing in from all sides, making even the smallest sound feel louder than it should. And the shadows don't just sit still, they seem deeper, like they're hiding something just out of sight, something that never fully reveals itself, but never truly disappears either. Tonight, I'm going to share 3 true horror stories from night shift workers, people who went into their jobs expecting quiet, uneventful nights and instead found themselves facing moments they still can't explain. And these aren't just quick scares or passing feelings of fear. These are the kind of experiences that stay with you long after they happen. The kind that return to your thoughts when everything else is silent. The first story comes from a night security guard who worked at a large office building on the outskirts of the city, a place that looked completely normal during the day, filled with conversations, ringing phones, and the constant rhythm of everyday life. But at night, that same building felt completely different. Like all of that energy had been drained away, leaving behind only empty hallways, dim lights, and a silence that never felt comfortable. His shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. And his job was simple. Walk through each floor, make sure every door was locked, confirm no one was inside, and spend the rest of the night watching the CCTV cameras from a small control room on the ground floor. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. In fact, it was almost too quiet. The kind of job where time barely moves and every hour feels longer than it should. And to pass the time, he would sometimes listen to music, trying to ignore the constant feeling that the building felt different at night, convincing himself it was just boredom, just his mind reacting to isolation. But then one night, something changed. Around 2:30 a.m., the time when everything felt at its most silent, when even distant sounds seemed to disappear, he was sitting in the control room, watching the monitors when he noticed something unusual. A light in the hallway of the 5th floor flickering on and off. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a minor electrical issue, something common in older buildings. But after watching it for a few seconds, he realized the flickering wasn't random. It followed a strange rhythm, turning on and off in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if something unseen was moving beneath it, triggering it again and again. He leaned forward slightly, focusing on the screen, trying to catch even the smallest movement, but the hallway remained completely empty, perfectly still, with nothing out of place. That's when a quiet sense of unease settled in his chest. Not sudden or overwhelming, but slow and persistent. The kind of feeling that makes you question what you're seeing even when there's no clear reason to. Trying to stay rational, he grabbed his flashlight and decided to check the floor himself. The moment he stepped out of the control room, the atmosphere felt different, colder, heavier, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in a way that made the building feel even more empty than before. When he reached the fifth floor, he slowed down without realizing it, his grip tightening around the flashlight as he approached the hallway, and when he finally turned the corner, everything looked normal. The lights were steady, no flickering, no movement, nothing unusual at all. He stood there for a moment, confused, scanning the area, trying to understand what he had seen earlier, but there was nothing. Just silence, stretching endlessly in front of him. Then suddenly, his walkie-talkie burst into life, with a sharp crackle of static, loud enough to make him flinch. He quickly picked it up, expecting to hear a coworker, but instead there was only low static at first, and then slowly, underneath that static, a faint sound began to form. It took him a moment to recognize it, but it sounded like breathing. He froze completely, holding the device closer, listening carefully, trying to convince himself it was just interference. But the sound didn't change. It remained steady, quiet, and disturbingly consistent, as if whatever was making that sound was aware that he was listening. For several long seconds, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the empty hallway, listening to something that shouldn't have been there. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. At that point, the uneasiness turned into something stronger, something impossible to ignore. So he quickly checked the rest of the floor and went straight back to the control room, trying not to think about what had just happened. But the moment he looked at the CCTV monitors again, something immediately felt wrong. For a brief second, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing, and then it clicked. On the screen showing the fifth floor hallway, he saw himself standing there, completely still, exactly where he had been earlier. The problem was, he wasn't there anymore. He was sitting in the control room. His heart began to race as he stared at the screen, unable to look away. Every instinct telling him this wasn't possible, and yet it was right there in front of him. Then slowly, the figure on the monitor moved. Not naturally, not like a person shifting their weight, but in a slow, controlled motion, as if it was aware of being watched. And then it turned its head, until it was looking directly into the camera. In that moment, a sharp wave of fear hit him. Without thinking, he ran out of the room and rushed back to the fifth floor, his footsteps echoing loudly as panic took over. But when he reached the hallway, it was empty, completely empty, no one there. No sound, no movement, nothing. He stood there, breathing heavily, shining his flashlight round, but the hallway remained still, as if nothing had ever happened. The rest of his shift passed, but nothing felt the same. Every shadow looked darker. Every small sound made him tense. And every time he looked at the monitors, he felt like something might be watching him back. The next night, he tried to ignore everything, convincing himself it was just exhaustion. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. And then, at exactly 2:30 a.m., the walkie-talkie turned on again. This time there was no static, no distortion, just a clear voice, quietly whispering his name. He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, staring at the monitors as the voice slowly faded away into silence. And in that moment, he understood something he couldn't explain. Whatever he experienced wasn't just a glitch or a trick of the mind. It was something aware, something that knew he was there. He finished his shift, But he never felt safe in that building again. In a week later, he quit without giving a reason. Even now, he refuses to talk about that night in detail because a part of him still believes that whatever appeared on that camera wasn't just inside the building. It had been watching him long before he ever noticed it, quietly waiting for the moment he would finally look back. The second story comes from a hospital night shift worker, a nurse who had been working in the emergency wing of a large city hospital for almost 3 years. And unlike most people, she was already used to the silence and tension that came with working overnight, because hospitals at night have a very different kind of atmosphere. Not completely quiet, but never truly alive either. Filled with distant machine beeps, soft footsteps echoing down empty hallways, and the constant feeling that something serious could happen at any moment. Over time, she had learned to ignore the uneasy feeling that sometimes crept in during the late hours, telling herself that it was just part of the job, just her mind reacting to exhaustion and stress. And for a long time, nothing unusual ever happened. But then one night, during a shift that started like any other, something changed. It was around 3:10 a.m., a time when most patients were asleep and the hospital felt at its most still. When she was sitting at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts, trying to stay focused despite the quiet heaviness of the night. That's when she noticed something strange. One of the monitors connected to a patient in a private room down the hall briefly flickered, not in the way a machine malfunctions, but in a way that made it look like the signal had been interrupted for just a second. She glanced at it, expecting it to stabilize, and it did, returning to normal almost immediately. But something about it didn't feel right. She checked the patient's file out of habit and saw that the room belonged to an elderly man who had been admitted earlier that day. Someone in stable condition, nothing critical, nothing that should have caused concern. Still, something about that brief flicker stayed in her mind. A few minutes later, one of the hallway lights outside that same room dimmed slightly before returning to normal. And this time, she noticed it clearly. It wasn't a full flicker, just a brief drop in brightness, like the power had hesitated for a moment. She looked up from her desk, staring down the hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. And for a second, everything looked completely still. Then she thought she saw something move near the patient's door. Not a clear figure, not something she could describe, just a slight shift in the darkness that made her pause. She stood up, telling herself it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks in low light, and walked down the hallway toward the room, her footsteps soft but echoing slightly in the quiet. As she got closer, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. That same quiet tension that doesn't come from seeing something, but from feeling like something is off. When she reached the door, she hesitated for just a second before pushing it open. Inside, everything looked normal. The patient was lying in bed, completely still, the monitor showing stable readings, the faint beeping continuing at a steady pace. She let out a slow breath, feeling slightly embarrassed for overthinking, and stepped inside to double-check everything. As she adjusted the blanket and checked the monitor more closely, she noticed something that made her pause. The reflection in the small glass panel of the medical cabinet showed the bed from a slightly different angle, and for a brief second, she thought she saw someone standing behind her. She turned around instantly, her heart jumping, but there was no one there. The room was empty except for her and the patient. She stood still for a moment, trying to calm herself, telling herself it was just a reflection glitch, just her eyes misinterpreting shapes in the glass. After a few seconds, she stepped out of the room and closed the door, trying to shake off the feeling. But as she walked back toward the nurse's station, something else happened. The monitor at her desk suddenly let out a sharp, continuous tone, the kind that usually indicates a serious issue. She rushed back, her heart racing, and looked at the screen. But everything was normal. The patient's vitals were stable, exactly the same as before. The alarm stopped on its own after a few seconds, leaving behind an unsettling silence. At that point, she couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something wasn't right. She decided to stay at the desk and keep a closer eye on the monitors, trying to stay alert. Minutes passed slowly, each second feeling longer than it should. And then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the same monitor flickered again. This time, it lasted longer. The screen distorted slightly, the image shifting just enough to feel wrong. And for a brief moment, instead of showing the patient lying in bed, it showed the bed empty. Completely empty. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. And then, just as suddenly, the image snapped back to normal, showing the patient exactly as before. She didn't wait this time. She immediately stood up and walked quickly down the hallway, her steps faster now, her heart beat louder in her ears. And when she reached the room, she pushed the door open without hesitation. The patient was there, exactly where he should be, lying still, unmoving. The monitor beside him continued its steady rhythm. She stepped closer, her hands slightly shaking now, and leaned in to check his breathing. And that's when she realized something was wrong. The patient wasn't breathing. The monitor was still showing a normal reading, still beeping at a steady pace. But the man in the bed wasn't moving at all. A cold feeling ran through her instantly. She reached out to check his pulse, and the moment her hand touched his wrist, the monitor behind her went completely silent. No beeping, no sound, just nothing. The sudden silence felt louder than any alarm. Slowly, she turned her head toward the monitor and saw that the screen was completely blank. Then, without any warning, it turned back on. But this time, it wasn't showing the patient. It was showing the room from a different angle, like a camera view. And in that view, she could see herself standing beside the bed, frozen, and behind her, something else was standing in the corner of the room. She didn't turn around. She didn't move. She just stared at the screen, her entire body locked in place, as the figure on the monitor remained completely still, too dark to make out clearly, but unmistakably there. And then, the screen flickered again. When it came back, everything was normal. The patient was back on the display. The monitor resumed its steady beeping. Slowly, she turned around. The corner of the room was empty. Nothing there. No movement, no sound. But the feeling didn't go away. She called for assistance immediately. And when other staff arrived, they confirmed that the patient had passed away. Minutes earlier, the official report said it was a natural cause, something that could happen without warning. But she knew that wasn't the part that stayed with her. What stayed with her was what she saw on that screen. She finished her shift, but she never worked another night in that hospital again. And even now, she avoids talking about that experience because a part of her still wonders if the monitor didn't glitch, if it showed her something she wasn't supposed to see, something that was already there, waiting in that room long before she walked in. The third story comes from a warehouse night shift worker, a man who had taken the job because it paid slightly more than his previous one, even though it meant working completely alone through the night in a massive storage facility on the edge of an industrial area, a place that during the day was filled with workers, forklifts moving constantly, and the noise of loading and unloading shipments. But at night, it became something entirely different, something empty, silent, and almost unnatural in its stillness. His shift started at midnight and ended at 8 a.m., and his job was simple: monitor incoming shipments, log inventory, and make sure everything inside the warehouse remained secure, which meant most of his time was spent sitting in a small office near the entrance, occasionally walking through the long aisles of stacked crates and metal shelves just to make sure nothing was out of place. For the first few nights, everything felt normal, quiet but manageable, the kind of silence you eventually get used to. And he even began to enjoy the isolation, telling himself that the emptiness made the job easier. But then, after about a week, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small details that didn't seem right, like the faint sound of something shifting in the distance when he knew he was the only one there, or the feeling that the aisles looked slightly different each time he walked through them, even though nothing had actually been moved. He ignored it at first, convincing himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. One night, around 3 a.m., while he was sitting in the office checking inventory logs, he heard a loud metallic sound echo from somewhere deep inside the warehouse, like something heavy had fallen or been dropped. The sound was sharp and sudden, breaking the silence in a way that made him sit up immediately. He waited for a moment, listening carefully, expecting to hear something else, but the warehouse returned to complete silence. After a few seconds, he stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and decided to check it out. As he walked deeper into the warehouse, the air felt colder, the silence heavier, and the beam of his flashlight cut through rows of tall shelves filled with boxes that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. When he reached the area where he thought the sound had come from, he stopped. One of the large metal crates near the end of an aisle was slightly out of place, just a few inches shifted from where it should have been. He frowned, trying to remember if it had been like that earlier, but he was sure it hadn't. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing softly, and placed his hand on the crate, checking if it had somehow been moved accidentally. It felt solid, heavy, impossible to move without equipment. A quiet sense of unease crept in. Then suddenly, somewhere behind him, deep in the warehouse, another metallic sound echoed. This time louder, closer. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just endless rows of shelves disappearing into shadow. He stood there for a moment, his grip tightening on the flashlight, his mind trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Deciding not to stay there any longer, he turned and started walking back toward the office. His pace slightly faster now, the silence behind him feeling heavier with every step. But as he walked, something felt wrong. The layout of the aisles didn't look the same anymore. The path he had taken just minutes ago now seemed different, like the shelves had shifted slightly, like the space itself wasn't arranged the way it should be. He slowed down, looking around, trying to recognize his surroundings, but the deeper he looked, the more unfamiliar everything felt. A quiet panic began to rise in his chest. Then, somewhere in the distance, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving between the aisles. He froze instantly, his breath catching as he listened. The footsteps didn't sound like echoes. They sounded real, deliberate, like someone was walking through the warehouse. He called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space, asking if anyone was there. But there was no response. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And then, the footsteps started again. This time closer. He didn't wait. He turned and started walking faster than faster, until he was almost running, trying to find his way back to the office. But the aisles seemed endless now, repeating in a way that made no sense. Like he was moving forward, but not getting any closer to the exit. His heartbeat grew louder in his ears, his breathing heavier, and the sound of footsteps behind him continued, matching his pace, never rushing, never stopping, just following. Then suddenly, his flashlight flickered. Once, twice, and then went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything instantly. He froze, standing completely still, his eyes struggling to adjust, but the darkness inside the warehouse felt absolute, like there was nothing to adjust to. And in that silence, he could hear it clearly now, breathing, not his own, something else. Close, very close. He didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. He just stood there, his entire body locked in place as the sound of breathing remained steady behind him. Seconds passed, maybe longer. He couldn't tell. And then suddenly, his flashlight flickered back on. The light cut through the darkness again, revealing the aisle in front of him. And for a brief moment, he thought he saw something at the end of it. A shape, standing still, too far to see clearly, but unmistakably there. And then it was gone. He didn't try to understand it. He didn't try to check again. He turned and ran, moving blindly through the aisles until he finally saw the faint outline of the office door in the distance. He rushed inside, slammed the door shut behind him, and locked it, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. For the rest of the night, he didn't leave that room. He sat there, staring at the security monitors, watching the empty aisles, waiting for something to appear. But nothing ever did. By the time his shift ended, the warehouse looked completely normal again, as if nothing had happened. But he knew what he heard. He knew what he felt. And most of all, he knew he hadn't been alone in that place. He quit the job the next day without giving any explanation. And even now, he refuses to go near that warehouse again, because a part of him still believes that whatever was moving through those aisles that night wasn't just following him. It was guiding him deeper inside, waiting for the moment he wouldn't find his way back out. And the strange thing about all of these stories isn't just what happened. It's the pattern they share. Because each of these people worked in completely different places, different environments, different cities, and yet the experiences feel connected in a way that's hard to ignore. A security guard watching empty hallways through a camera, a nurse seeing something that shouldn't exist on a monitor, a warehouse worker hearing footsteps in a place where no one else was supposed to be. Three different people, three different nights, but the same feeling, the same presence, something that doesn't fully reveal itself, something that doesn't act randomly, something that waits, watches, and only shows itself when you're completely alone. And maybe that's the part that makes these stories more unsettling than they seem at first, because none of these experiences happen during chaos or panic. They happen during silence, during moments when nothing else was supposed to happen. It makes you wonder if the night itself changes things, or if it simply reveals what's already there, hidden in places we don't pay attention to during the day. Because think about it. How many places do we walk through every day without noticing anything unusual? How many empty hallways, quiet rooms, or dark corners do we ignore simply because nothing happens while we're there? But at night, when everything slows down, when the noise disappears, when there's nothing left to distract you, maybe that's when you start to notice things you weren't meant to see. Or maybe it's not about noticing at all. Maybe it's about being noticed. Because in all three of these stories, there's one detail that stands out more than anything else. None of them felt like they accidentally witnessed something. It felt like something was aware of them, watching them, reacting to them, waiting for them to realize it was there. And once they did, it didn't stop. The guard heard his name. The nurse saw something standing behind her. The worker was followed through darkness. Different experiences, but the same message. You weren't alone. And maybe that's the real reason these stories stay with them, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt after it was over. That quiet, lingering thought that doesn't go away. The feeling that even when they left those places, something didn't leave with them. So the next time you find yourself awake late at night, in a quiet room, or walking through an empty space where everything feels just a little too still, pay attention to that feeling. Not the obvious sounds, not the things you can explain, but the small, subtle moments that don't quite make sense. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you clearly see. They're the ones that only make themselves known when you're alone, and by the time you realize it, it might already be watching you too.